Hello. Oh, okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special edition of our visiting speaker series here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. I say special for a few reasons. For one, this is the final installment of the series for this semester. So I would like to begin by thanking everybody, so many familiar faces, for maintaining consistent participation and attendance throughout the series over the past several months. It's really been a great pleasure to be involved. For another reason, this is a special occasion because our speaker today, Professor Paul D'Ambrosio, is perhaps somebody who in these parts needs no introduction, not only because of his prolific contributions to his areas of study in Chinese philosophy, but also in his capacity as frequent co-author with one of our very own, Professor Muller. To say a bit more, though, Professor D'Ambrosio is professor of Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University. He's also fellow of the Institute of Modern Chinese Thought and Culture, dean of the Center for Intercultural Research, and co-director of the English Language Graduate Program, all at East China Normal University. Author of countless articles in Chinese philosophy, a number of books, just to mention a few, again, as co-author with Professor Hans-Georg Muller, one of which, quite recent, goes by the title You and Your Profile, another, just a few years prior, Genuine Pretending, both published with Columbia University Press. Today, Professor D'Ambrosio is here to present to us some work by the title Intention, Ethics, and Convention in Daoism, Guo Xiang and Ziran and Wuwei. So with that said, I will hand things over to Professor D'Ambrosio for the usual talk, followed by Q&A. And if we could all thank Professor D'Ambrosio as he begins.
Thanks, Ben, for the nice introduction and for everyone coming out on this cold December day. Thanks for braving the elements. Yeah, I didn't know I was your last speaker, so I'm sorry about that. I guess the semester's already over. I'll try to make this as painless as possible. I really like University of Macau. I like all the students, the colleagues here, so it's really great to be here yet again. And thanks a lot, Ben. This was the sort of last minute that we scheduled, so Alan helped a lot, and Ben, I'm sure Maggie and maybe other people, so thanks everyone for helping. And yeah, thanks everyone who has been meeting with me and such. It's really nice. Okay, so I need to find my PowerPoint. Oh, okay. Great. Oh yeah, sure. Okay. I might sit for, yeah, we'll see. Thanks. Okay, great. So as Ben said, the title of my presentation today is Intention, Ethics, Convention, and Daoism, Guo Xiang on Ziran and Wuwei. So this is actually the title of a paper that I just signed the agreement to publish this morning, actually. So maybe it was good luck that I was presenting it to you guys here today. In this paper, I take Guo Xiang to be a significant scholar of the Zhuangzi and of Daoism in general. And I'll do so again in the presentation. So if you were looking for some sort of straight up Ziran Wuwei type of presentation, it's not exactly what you're getting. My argument is more that when we look at early Taoist texts, we should take early commentators, but also contemporary Chinese scholars very seriously. So that's this is a sort of representation of that type of spirit, right? Or that type of research. So I don't claim to really make too many big contributions, which you're supposed to do in academia, but I hope that, especially for some of the students, this will be interesting. I talked with Hans-Georg Muller before setting up the talk, and I said, what type of talk should I give? And he said, forget about the professors. He said, give a talk to the students. I said, okay. So I give them a talk about how I think scholarship should be done. This is a sort of style that I write many of my papers in. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you guys. Okay, so again, Guo Xiang is not a representative of the Zhuangzi, much less the Laozi, right? So like if you want to say, well, what you said about Ziran or Wuwei sort of is in conflict with whatever Shenbuhai or yeah, the Laozi, let's say, that's totally fair. We can have a conversation about that. Again, I'm not claiming everybody needs to read Guo Xiang and everybody needs to write about Guo Xiang, but I think ignoring scholars like Guo Xiang is I don't know why people do it, actually. That's just that's basically it. I think you don't need to ignore him. So people who are familiar, of course, know that we have little idea what the Zhuangzi looked like before Guo Xiang did whatever he did to it, right? There's all types of theories. But I mean, honestly, we're just not that sure, right? Which characters did he change? Which phrases did he rephrase? Which chapters did he rearrange? We have no idea. So I also think, while you can definitely distinguish between Guo Xiang's thought sometimes and what you might call more like original Zhuangzian thought, on some level you have no basis to do this as well, right? So I think it makes sense to take Guo as a very serious scholar. So my argument also, right, is that we should take traditional and contemporary Chinese scholars more seriously, especially when doing research in English language scholarship. I think anyone who, if you just open the latest edition of Dao or Philosophy East West or Asian philosophy, right, or if you look at books published in English or English articles in other places, you don't find very many. If you look at the bibliography of these, you don't really find Chinese resources, right? You might find some primary text, maybe a Zhu Si or Wang Bi here or there, but that might just be for some minor point, which, by the way, the author already thought of themselves, right? So they look usually to the commentaries to find agreement, not to learn from them. Of course, I don't know this, but this is what it seems like in my experience. And I think that's really strange, and I don't think we should do that. I don't think you guys should do that, especially people here don't do that, but I don't think you guys should do that when you go forward on your research. So yeah, so this is an argument for trying to build more bridges between Chinese language and English language scholarship, both past and present. So of course you can object, right, that there's no reason to take Chinese interpretations more seriously just because they're Chinese. That's not what I'm arguing. I don't propose that Guo Xiang is necessarily a better reader of the Zhuangzi than Brooke Ziporin or Chris Fraser. I just suggest that, you know, again, you look at all these articles in English and they have plenty of English language scholars. Why don't we have some Chinese language scholars? So at least put them next to the English language scholars. That's a major argument that I'm not really making in this paper, but the paper is a demonstration of this type of argument, right? And it's a demonstration of what happens to research when you do something like this. So also, by the way, I mean, I do think Guo Xiang spent a heck of a long time working on the Zhuangzi, right? And he has more temporal proximity, and his research was taken very seriously and still is the most important research on the Zhuangzi, right? So I think you, to some extent, need to respect this, right? Because we're working usually on traditions, not you know, the Zhuangzi is some, I don't know, some ant or something, right? And we can do some scientific study on this ant. So yeah, I think it makes sense to work within a tradition and sort of recognize that in your research. So yep, this is then hopes to be sort of a model, right? This presentation for how you can do this type of research. So Ziran and Wuwei, I'm sure everyone knows, are outside of Dao the most popular concepts, perhaps, in philosophical appreciations of the Laozi or Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi. And although scholars can recognize some distinctions, I'm not going to talk about those distinctions because much of the research that I'm responding to doesn't make a distinction between Ziran and Wuwei. So that's why I'm not making one. If you'd like to discuss that in the Q&A, I'm all up for it. Although I'd rather hear what you have to say about that, because I don't think I have very much interesting to say, to be honest. Okay, so I think there are three interpretive themes that mark recent and a lot of English language scholarship on Ziran and Wuwei as breaking from traditional interpretations. And I think they potentially mislead with regard to developing readings of the Laozi or Zhuangzi, which are much more thorough, or tong. What I mean by that, Chinese students know what it means, right? 你说得很通, right? Like that means, basically that's like the highest praise you can give something in Chinese. And it means that your argument sort of goes through the text, you could say, right? So it connects different pieces of the text. It can mean that your argument goes through the tradition. It connects different parts of the tradition through not just one text, let's say, but it can also be saying it's Tong, it goes through the Laozi and the Zhuangzi, something like this. So I don't think many of the contemporary English language discussions of Ziran and Wuwei are very Tong. That's my argument. I'm not saying they're like good or bad or right or wrong. I just don't think they're very tone. So the first type of interpretive theme that we find surrounding Ziran and Wuwei research is purpose, intention, effort, consciousness. And similar terms, they're used to demarcate what counts as Ziran Wuwei and what counts as not Ziran Wuwei, right? So purposelessness, non-intentionality, effortlessness, sometimes non-self-consciousness, different words in this type of cluster, right? I'm also not focusing on like one of these words or another, right? So if you want to have a discussion about intention being different from effort, okay, sure, but most of the scholars are using them as more or less interchangeable. So that's what I'm responding to here. So this type of attitude, or this type of practice, whatever, is supposed to be Ziran Wuwei. And my argument is that this is incorrect, because you can have purpose, intention, and effort and still be considered Ziran Wuwei. The second is Ziran and Wuwei are frequently read as ethical or moral. This is kind of curious, and we have really great arguments for not reading them as ethical or moral. The third is that the third is a rejection of convention and customs is often situated as an important aspect of Ziran and Wuwei. And I also think that this is clearly wrong, or not tong. So this research argues that on all three counts, contemporary scholarly consensus lacks nuance and depth. This is where I was going to say I didn't think they were necessarily wrong, but I do kind of think they're wrong, because they lack this nuance and depth, which would make them much more accurate. I do want to note, though, that the scholars that I'm talking about, like Alan Chan or Edward Slingerland or Karen Lai, I really like these people, both like personal. Actually, I don't know Alan Chan, but I like them both personally, and I really appreciate their research. I just think on these points, they could be more nuanced. And I think that's largely the case for most of the research. I just think on this point, it's a little bit sloppy, basically. So on the surface, then, it does make sense to recognize that too much intentionality, purpose, or being overly self-conscious can be problematic when discussing Ziran and Wuwei, but this does not eschew all types of intention, purpose, or consciousness as such. More precisely, I think Ziran and Wuwei should be viewed as an attitude or a disposition that one takes towards their own intention, purpose, or consciousness. No specific intention or purpose, I would say, is necessarily opposed to Ziran Wuwei. I guess you could come up with some really creative one to try to stump me here, but we just take this in a general way. I think it makes sense. So how one deals with intentions and purposes is what matters most. Similarly, while the Laozi and Zhuangzi often praise being Ziran and Wuwei along with other types of attitudes or dispositions, this does not have to mean that these are ethical or moral approbations, especially since contemporary academic discourse on ethics and morality, I would say, is rather limited from a Ziran Wuwei perspective. In fact, I think it would be much more accurate to understand Ziran and Wuwei as opposed to the types of ethics and morality we normally find in academic philosophy today. And just as intention and purpose can and must include Ziran and Wuwei, so too must it include customs and convention. The Laozi and Zhuangzi do not offer resources for completely abandoning social practices any more than they ask one to construct a self that's somehow independent of others. So Ziran and Wuwei always include some degree of convention and custom. So then my major sort of argument, or I guess my major contribution here, is that I think Ziran and Wuwei should be better appreciated as speaking to attitudes or dispositions. I think that they should be understood in terms of degrees rather than categories. And I think that they are more like advice for ways of reflecting. Exactly because they are this, they are not constituted of an ethic. Okay, so this is the most sort of speculative part of the paper. I talk about why do people read Ziran and Wuwei as anti-intention, as ethical, moral, or as anti-convention. Of course, I don't know, right? I can't like open up Slingerland's head and say like figure out why he said effortless action, which is also a fairly good translation, just not philosophically very nuanced, right? So I think using broad strokes, we can understand how a focus on intention, ethics, and convention in reading the Ziran and Wuwei are reflected of contemporary philosophical concerns. The problem, I think, though, is that people take a contemporary philosophical concern and then they sort of push it onto these concepts. And I think this is really problematic because it means that we don't really learn from the concepts. We don't have an interesting type of critical distance that would allow us to reflect on the problems in a way that we don't already sort of think. That was a little bit not that clear, right? But you can think of environmentalism as a good example, right? I know Ellen, I think, agrees with me on this, right? The Daoism is not really an environmentalist type of philosophy. And I think the part of the reason it's problematic to read it as environmentalism is because then you learn nothing about a new sort of perspective, right? It has nothing to contribute when you read it as environmentalism because you just read it as reflecting basically what you already think about environmentalism. If you read it not as environmentalism, then I think it actually sort of paradoxically gives you much more room to actually reflect on environmental issues and perhaps think about them in a more interesting way. So I think the same thing goes for these three problematic interpretive themes that I'm mentioning today. I really like the work of Hartmut Rosa. I highly recommend this book. It's very short. It might remind you of the weather outside today. So in this book, The Uncontrollability of the World, and in most of Hartmut Rosa's work in general, he talks about how in nearly every area of life, we find an incessant desire to make the world more engineerable, more predictable, more available, accessible, and disposable in all of its aspects. So I think this is something sort of common, right? You can find this in Heidegger, you can find this in many contemporary things. Basically, any thinker who's talking about whatever modernity, right, would be talking about this as well. So I think a lot of philosophers, of course, find this type of attitude problematic, and then they sort of read onto Ziran and Wuwei a similar type of critique, and that's both incorrect and I think leaves Daoism not really giving us much of a contribution to contemporary philosophical concerns. This is the easiest one and the one that people could argue with me the most and the one that I would engage with argument the least. I simply think that people read Ziran and Wuwei as ethical because because ethics is just so popular in academia. I don't know how many talks were given in this lecture series, but I would venture a guess that, I don't know, 100% of them had some sort of ethical twist. I mean, maybe not, right? But you know what I mean, right? Like if you basically every article, every book has some sort of ethical slant. And it's really interesting because when you read a book that's more descriptive, then there's always a chapter at the end, right? That's kind of just pushed in there. That's like, and by the way, this is going to make everyone's lives better because something, right? So I think basically that's why people insist on reading Ziran and Wuwei as so ethical. right? And you always encounter this problem in Daoism. What about Nazis, right? Of course, if only, right, like virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology, if only they had existed before the Nazis, we would never would have had the Nazis, right? But unfortunately, we developed them all in the last 30 years, so we weren't able to combat them. The third, and the one that I'm most sure of, is why people read it as anti-convention. For the sake of keeping the lecture series coming to a quick end, I won't talk about this too much, but I'm more than happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I think people read Ziran and Wuwei as anti-conventional because we live in an age of authenticity, and authenticity is often defined as being anti or somehow in conflict with convention and custom. So I think that's just reread onto Ziran and Wuwei and Daoism in general. Garrick and I have talked about this. I wrote an article about this, I don't know, in 2014 or something. Chen Guiying, right, who also uses the word authentic. When I talked with him, he actually agrees with me. He says it's not authenticity, but he has a sort of a different, sometimes Chinese understandings of a term can be different. So, but yeah, I'm more than happy to discuss this as well. So, examples of the problematic themes and how you have them, they're really often very concisely discussed too, right? So Alan Chan talks about the concept of virtue and whether interpreted in terms of authenticity or the purity of fullness of qi depicts a pristine, natural, and socio-political order in which naturalness, ziran, and non-action, wuwei, are the norm, and the ethics of wuwei rests on this insight. So Chan then further discusses this in terms of non-intentionality, saying that Wuwei cannot be a prescription that requires deliberate effort, and talks about deliberate action as characterized as going against human tendencies. Chan then goes on to connect this to the third theme, convention, writing that at its core, an arguably Taoist worry is that social conventions and structures damage our natural spontaneity and interfere with efficient functioning of our natural powers. Again, I'm going to disagree with basically everything he said, but Alan Chan is a phenomenal scholar, and if you do any work on Weijin Xuanxue, you have to read him. Edward Slingerland writes a lot about these same themes as well. I'll skip this slide for the sake of time, but effortless action, I actually recommend this to some students, but with some caution, right? I think a lot of what he discusses is really good, but I think there's just too much concentration on effortlessness. And then Karen Lai also develops her own account of Ziran Wuwei ethics, which is very much in step with Chan and Slingerland. She finds themes related to intention and convention negated in such an ethic. She writes, the account of Ziran Wuwei ethic challenges the top-down style of moral reasoning as an adequate model for ethics. Moral sensitivity, that is putting oneself in another's shoes. So, right, so this is going to be her. She said, then this is the first and foundational aspect of ethical action. Has anyone here studied Guo Xiang? A little bit? No? You know the concept of ji, of footprints or traces? Yeah, right. Phi, do you know? You don't know? Yeah, what is the ji? What is the, do you know why he thinks it's problematic? Okay, so he talks about footprints or traces, right? This is like let's say I go to Dimitra's class, right? And then I think it's a really great class and I try to teach just like her. So what he would say is I'm usually following the footprints. Yeah, I'm just trying to copy her, or I'm just trying to model her, right? And this is like a footprint or a trace. What I should be following is soi ji, which is that which left the trace, which is the Ziran. Like she was a Ziran teacher, and that's what made her a good teacher. But if I just follow actually what she did, I'm just following the traces. So it's really interesting because it's a very similar model. And according to Karen Lai, this is what constitutes a Ziran Wuwei ethic. And according to Guo Xiang, this is exactly what you should never do. Right? So it's a very interesting dynamic here. So she goes on to state how one sees a particular situation and understands the self and others is prior to deliberation about the ethical course of action, right? And then she just, basically goes on to say that acceptability and normativity are somehow pre-reflective. Okay, so now we get to some responses from Guo Xiang. Okay, this is his sort of basic discussion of Wuwei. It should be more sort of in Zhuangzi studies, it's sort of a classical discussion, but it's not always well known with people who just study Daoism. But he writes, if it has been declared that one should be called a master of Wuwei only after he has folded his hands and keeps silent in the mountains and woods, right? So basically he's saying, you know, that some people say, oh, does Wuwei mean you don't do anything, right? And everyone knows, no, it doesn't mean that, right? That's silly. That's a silly idea. And also you can't not do anything, right? You're just laying on the ground. You're still doing something, right? So it's not possible, but Guo Xiang is sort of taking this a little seriously. And he says, such a statement would have provided a reason to have the sayings of Master Zhuang and Master Lao rejected by those who hold power. Those who hold power regard themselves as necessarily involved in the realm of Youwei. This is like actively doing something like this, or it's just the opposite of Wuwei, right? But again, it's sort of limited. I don't know the best way to translate this, especially if we take it more as an attitude or a disposition, right? So we can just call it like something like activity or having activity, from which there's no turning back. So it's important to note, though, that even though he's talking about rulers here, Guo Xiang doesn't distinguish between sort of the psychological states of rulers and people. So then we can look at another quote like this right next to this one, and it tells us a lot, right? He says, the people's intentions are ziran, they follow them and use them, right? So this is a sort of positive statement, right, about intention. So it should, in fact, come with little surprise that Guo Xiang makes such an argument, because this type of thinking, right, or this type of luozi, I don't want to say logic in English because maybe you're going to trip me up, Ben, later on. So I'm just saying luozi in Chinese instead, or suwei moshi, right, like some way of thinking or so, used by Guo Xiang to understand Ziran Wuwei, is the same type of luozi or suwei moshi used to understand, let's say, Wu Yu or Wu Zhi, right? No desire or no knowledge, from the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi. So scholars generally agree that Wu Yu or Wu Zhi do not imply a pure negation of desire or knowledge, right? Not having desire is not about having no desires, right? But it's rather about not being too attached to one's desires or not letting their desires get out of control. Similarly, wuzhi is not ignorance or not knowing, but it's not getting too obsessed with knowledge and suggesting that people should not contend zheng based on their knowledge. So it's no far stretch then to imagine that wuxin, right? This is what some people use to argue for having no intention, right? Which literally means to have no heart mind or lack of heart mind, that this should be understood also in a metaphorical sense, right? So the Zhuangzi, so then Ziran and Wuwei are no more opposed to intention than they are opposed to action itself, right? You understand what I'm saying here is just like you obviously, to be Wuwei, you don't just fold your hands and go chill on the hills in Koluan, right? That you can actually still go to class or so, right? That actually then you can also have intention or effort or consciousness is fine. So the crux of Ziran Wuwei lies then in not in rejecting intention, but in appreciating certain types of intention or certain types of dispositions or attitudes towards one's own intentions, which is basically how we understand Wu Yu and Wu Zhi, right? So just as Ziran Wuwei is constituted by a certain attitude or disposition towards action, so too is it constrained by a certain attitude, or sorry, constituted by a certain attitude or disposition towards intention. This is my favorite quote from Guo Xiang. This was actually very inspirational for Georg and my work on genuine pretending. The quote is, although the sage might be found in the imperial court, his heart mind is no different from what it would be out in the midst of the forests and mountains. So I don't know how you're going to be in the court and have no intention, right? That's obviously not going to be possible. So unless we want to argue that intention, purpose, effort, and consciousness are external, and then for Guo Xiang, Ziran and Wuwei are largely connected to his notions of xing, right? Or zi, or fen. So he talks, for example, about ren xing, right? Ren xing in contemporary Chinese means like when your girlfriend goes crazy. But in Guo Xiang, it means to go by your own xing, to go by your nature, to go by your natural disposition, something like this. So unless we, and zi he uses kind of the same, and also fen, like fen lia, the fen, right? So that, but that's more indicative of like a social role or something, but he uses it in both senses of a social role, and also fen is like tianfei, like what you get from tian or something, right? So it can, you can think of it as the sort of contingent, like the talents or so that you have, even something like how tall or short you are, how, what your color your hair is. I guess everyone's hair was black, so he probably wasn't thinking about that, but other things, right? So just as desire, so so intention, purpose, effort, and consciousness, unless we think that they're external to xing and zi, then we have to admit that they're part of being Ziran and Wuwei, right? Just as desire, knowledge, and the heart mind are not outside of natural dispositions and can be handled in a Ziran Wuwei manner, so too can intentions. Invoking the language of the Lao Tzu, Guo Xiang writes, get rid of ornamentation and follow Ren, plain intentions. So intentions themselves are fine. People actually should follow them so long as they are plain or unadorned. Same thing with you, right? Desires. Because basically the problem is having intentions tainted by seeking advantage or something external to one's natural dispositions. Accordingly, the danger of not being Ziran Wuwei is not that intentions are relied on, but rather that one opposes their natural dispositions. So Guo writes, let your demeanor express compliance and comply with your inclinations. Don't falsify them for the sake of advantage. Yeah, you might be noticing, Phi, that this is this is Qing, right? So what this is not really E, this is not Zhi, this is, but also the discussion that I'm responding to is not very clear on which Chinese, they're not talking about one Chinese term, right? So this is not my translation. This is Richard John Lind's translation. And I think it's fine to sort of be a little bit loose about these. Also because things like intention, right, effort, consciousness, you could probably tell, well, I won't put you on the spot, but you could just pretend. You could tell me about all about how they're different, right? I mean, they are different in some ways, but in these discussions, I'm just giving a sort of general response, right? So this is Qing, which maybe you would say, it's not really intention, but it's basically has this function here. Okay, so then you could say, isn't this already an ethic, right? And you have all different types of ethics that you could choose from. This was just part of the list. I couldn't even screenshot the whole thing, right? So wouldn't it fit in one of these potentially? So I want to back up for a second and then just talk a little bit about Xuanxue in general, because Xuanxue in general is very skeptical or weary, or actually very much against ethics or morality. So the perspective of Xuanxue thinkers, of course, varies greatly, but one general agreement that unites them is the worry that any codification of ethical moral ideas can easily and almost necessarily give rise to pretense and hypocrisy. So the problem then is twofold. First, when people can pretend to be ethical or moral, which is easy if you have prescribed, right? You have to remember too, like you're living in a small community, you have a really thick sense of shared social norms, right? So then it's pretty easy to fake these things, right? So when people can pretend to be ethical or moral, and then when you have social and political structures that are built on these ideas, and this is actually what they're responding to, right? How the fall of the Han, which according to many late Han thinkers and Xuanxue thinkers, is just because of falsity and pretense. So you have real problems with this, right? They become hollow, they crumble when you make ethics or morality. The second is that seeking to be ethical or moral only gets one away from their natural tendencies, right? If you want to follow Xing or Zi, right, you can't really cognize something and then try to follow it. That doesn't mean you can't learn, right? I can still learn from going to Dimitra's class, right? Because the understanding is that everyone's always transforming, right? Your Xing or your Zi is always transforming by the environment around you, right? Like you go outside and you're freezing cold, right? It's the middle of winter in Macau. You come inside, at least the heat's on, so you can warm up a little bit, right? And this is also, according to Guo Xiang, this is also your Xing changing, right? So just like your Xing changes according to temperature, it changes according to the people you're around, the experiences you have, and things like this. So it's not as if you can't learn anything, but when you like when I sit there and really try to be warm when I'm out in the freezing Macau December, right? I can't make myself warm. And similarly, according to Guo Xiang, you can't change your Xing by trying to change it. And when you do, that's when you mess things up. And that's just not Guo Xiang, that's basically all Xuanxue all major Xuanxue thinkers. So in contemporary English language discourse on Ziran and Wuwei, most scholars, and I could give you a list of at least a dozen, don't have, well, sorry, if I'm talking about scholars who don't reference Xuanxue thinkers, it's probably basically all of them. And then in Chinese discourse, right, basically none of them don't. Right? You're not going to pick up a book on the Zhuangzi that doesn't have a discussion of Guo Xiang in Chinese. I don't think. That doesn't mean that the scholar always agrees, right? But that they do actively engage with Guo Xiang's thought and other traditional commentaries. So, and I think not doing this really means that people miss out on different arguments about Ziran and Wuwei. And understandings of them, especially in terms of thinking that Ziran and Wuwei can somehow be constitutive of an ethic, because it's so clear that they're basically anti-ethic or anti-ethics, sorry. And then this can really be summarized very well, I think, by just looking at, I could have chosen quotes from so many different Xuanxue thinkers, and I could have chosen so many different quotes, but I just chose two. One from Wang Bi, where he says, acting for humaneness, and thus hypocrisy and pretense are formed. To put this in better English, hypocrisy and pretense are formed when one acts for humaneness. Guo Xiang basically has the same idea. He says, when humaneness is the result of envying others, this humaneness is already false. And then we have very similar discussions in contemporary Chinese discourse. Okay, can you do it for me? Yeah, just read it, just real quick. No, the Chinese. Yeah, the English. No, just the English.
Hello, this is your MC now. Right. Additionally, many Chinese scholars have rejected the contemporary drive to read Ziran Wuwei as constitutive of ethics or morality. Chen Yun plainly writes of Dao, De, virtue or power, and Ziran, Dao and De are in no way the same as modern Chinese word for morality, much less equivalent of English morality or virtue. Go on. Yeah. Okay. Chen continues to go on, to quote from the Zhuangzi, before saying that when we take Taoist ideas as moral in the contemporary sense, this leads to Wei, that is, pretense, hypocrisy, or falsity, when effective and good actions are seen as morality itself and then lose their meaning. An enemy. Yeah. I'll pass it down. Your acceptance on you. I will give you this opportunity.
Okay. Okay. Wang Chongjian adds to this discussion. They Taoists criticize the humanism of Confucian humanness, duty, morality, and denounce knowledge and technical civilization, not primarily in themselves, but because they often lead to hypocrisy and deception, and are often used as instruments to the detriment of the human mind and the social organism. Humanness, duty, morality leads to the loss of what is genuine. They Taoists are after what is genuine. This is completely Ziran. It is not only that there is no connection between morality and external moral goals, but also that there is not even a connection between morality and a pure moral motive or intention.
Ziran, Wuwei, and ethics Guo Xiang. When Guo worries about ethical values, he often references going against natural dispositions and the rise of pretense through following traces or footprints.
Okay. So again, this idea of footprints, right, is that you see it in the image here, right? But that someone has gone, basically someone who does something well is doing it in a Ziran way, according to Guo Xiang. But everything about their situation, who they are, right? They're saying everything about them is different from you, right? I mean, we can even walk it the same exact way, right? But also the path is going to be different. The weather is going to be different. Maybe it rained, maybe it didn't, like all these different things, right? So, and of course, all images are have some restrictions. So that's just walking, right? Imagine acting, right? Like imagine interacting with other people. So it's always going to be different. So following traces, any type of trace is always problematic. And asking people to follow any model is therefore always problematic. And following a model or at least thinking in terms of some models, I would say is fairly central for most contemporary academic discussions of ethics. So again, I'm not saying, and Georg will disagree with me, I'm not saying Guo Xiang is necessarily rejecting all types of ethics, just all of the types of ethics that I happen to know about. So often the traces that Guo then is most vehemently criticizing are those related to ethics. Traces lead people away from being Ziran Wuwei and away from their natural dispositions. Ethical ideas are the worst traces because they directly target action and attitudes, wrenching them away from people's own natural dispositions, and thus they're being Ziran and Wuwei. Accordingly, ethical values are actually at the heart of problems, including ethical problems in the world. So I'm not sure that he goes so far as Georg, but they share a sentiment here. Okay, you can read this one then, Phi. Yeah, stop looking at your phone. You got to read the screen now.
Engaging with others so no harm is done to them has nothing to do with humaneness. Yet the footprints of humaneness are left in the process. That which always has principles of behavior appropriately applied has nothing to do with duty. Yet as an outcome, duty appears in the process. Therefore, to behave appropriately so that no harm is done has nothing to do with any summons to humaneness and duty. Nevertheless, people of the whole world rush around, abandoning their real selves and conforming to those of others, which causes them to lose their original and constant natures. Therefore, confusion of mind does not come from bad people, but always rests with those who seem to be good. Thus, humaneness and duty are tools that confuse and obstruct the world.
Great insight, Phi. Thanks. Yeah, you like it? It's good, right? You got to read some Guo Xiang. All right. So even if we take the idea then of not doing harm and then try to make this our new ethical value, the same basic structure that Guo finds problematic in ethics would present anew, right? It is not the precise content of any ethical value that Guo rejects, but any type of valorization of any particular type of idea or value or whatever thinking structure that can be detailed and made into any type of model. So as soon as we come to cognize something, to be aware of what it is and to know it, this already leads us away from Dao or away from our own Xing or Zi. For example, he talks when the Zhuangzi praises being simple and plain. Guo writes, when people have such awareness of external models, they estrange themselves from Tao by trying to be good, right? So trying to be good is actually like a huge problem, as Fai just told us, right? For Guo Xiang. And a few lines later, he continues, once the footprints of the sage were manifest, humaneness and duty become not genuine, and the rites and music so estrange people from their natural dispositions that all they could manage to do was feign outer appearance. Once sages appear, such fraud happens. But though this is so, what can be done about it? Okay, so in Gore's writing, then the sage indicates a model person. This is kind of something we need to pay like a little bit of attention to, because I think there's a difference, right, between the way that we might think of a sage and the way that Gore might think of a sage. So in contemporary philosophical discourse, I think we can understand Guo Xiang's understanding of a sage more like roughly equivalent to some type of formula, rule, guideline when discussing ethics, right? So they didn't really talk like this, but this is basically functionally equivalent in Gore's understanding. So once ethics becomes explicit, it cannot but become a model. And as a model, it is necessarily a trace, which means that it can only really function to move people away from their natural dispositions. In other words, ethics construed in any codified, institutionalized, formulaic manner is always the exact opposite of Ziran and Wuwei. Wang Zhongjiang summarizes this type of general Taoist sentiment. He says, cancel all moral conceptions, return to the genuine Ziran and Wuwei, and be without desires. Okay, so that's basically the whole presentation. I actually forgot to finish this slide, so there's a little bit of a blah 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 that I just noticed, but just again to summarize, I'm arguing that Ziran and Wuwei are best appreciated as speaking to attitudes or dispositions towards intentions, as anti-ethics, and as attitudes or dispositions towards convention and custom, which we didn't get to, but of course we can talk about in the Q&A. That they should be understood in terms of degrees rather than categories. I think that this is basically my two major insights. And also that they offer advice for ways of reflecting, and they're not constitutive of an ethic. So the other thing is that when you're modeling something, right, or when you have an ethic, or even when you think about Ziran and Wuwei as in terms of categories, and when you try to understand this can be Ziran and Wuwei and this isn't, you sort of shift the philosophical responsibility from the person to whatever the philosophical category or the rule or whatever, right? And I don't think that's how well, in my perspective, that's not really that philosophical. And I think most good philosophers don't work like that. And I think Taoism especially doesn't operate like that. It rather just gives you advice for things you can reflect on and ways you can reflect, but you have to do the work yourself, right? It doesn't just give you something and then you just have to sort of put it into practice. And that, I think that's sort of like worrisome or almost sort of scary from a contemporary academic perspective, right? Because we want to come up with something that will like whatever fix the world, not something that like, oh, people could think about this and maybe they might be a little bit better, but like maybe they wouldn't be, you know? But I think that's what really good philosophy does. And I think we should respect Ziran and Wuwei as concepts that function in this sort of real philosophical way as well, and stop trying to make certain models out of them. Okay, that's my presentation. Welcome to ECNU anytime you want to come. We're always happy to have more academic exchange with professors and students, right? You were there a couple weeks ago. I don't remember your name. Okay. Wendy, okay, yeah, you were there, right? We had a good time, right? Yeah, so anytime anyone wants to come or you're in Shanghai, let me know. You can stop by, you can come to class, you can give a lecture. We're happy to have you. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Professor D'Ambrosio. Now, it looks like your presentation was very well timed, actually, because we're back on track, even in light of the somewhat late start. So that's great, which means we can have a full Q&A ahead. And so, as usual, I'm happy to start a queue on your behalf so you can just focus on the questions. And that goes for everybody here and in the Zoom. You know the drill. I say the same thing every time. Okay. We could start with Ellen while other people maybe think up some ideas. Okay.
Mine might be comments rather than questions. Okay, Professor, thank you all so much. Very interesting paper. And but I do have a couple of questions, maybe comments here. Let's start with the third one, convention here.
Yes.
You say you try to give a different perspective here. But let me think about, because you talk about Guo Xiang, let's talk about Xuanxue. And then you know that in Xuanxue, there's a well-known saying, actually originated from from actually not Ruan Ji, I think Ji Kang. And this notion of in Chinese is called 超明教而任自然.
Yeah.
So of course you have this contrast between Mingjiao doctrinal teachings and also Ziran. So here, you know, doctrinal teaching, it might refer to maybe conventional teaching or Confucianism here. Yeah, I think you're right here in a sense that it's not just say convention per se, but maybe conventional norms or social norms as taken as convention, which would be challenged by this concept of Ziran.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah. But then I want to push, because I'm thinking about another interpreter I mentioned to you and during our lunchtime is a Buddhist one, is 知道理, you know, 知顿. And very interesting, he used his own term to interpret 庄子自然, and his words is 物物而不物于物. Okay, I don't know how to translate in English. I used to make fun. I say to sing things, but not to be seen by saying. Okay, but also in Guo Xiang, you have this notion of 物者. So here, maybe I think, you know, back to also Zhi Daolin's interpretation of Wu things here. Maybe there's still something dealing with, you know, at least, you know, this has something to do with this kind of a non-conventional way of acting. And because convention, like back to the second one, always have this notion of like being established, being authority, being examples that you need to follow. So that might be also then, you know, try to challenge, you know, this kind of notion. And also back to, I think you're right, the notion, this idea, concept of trace is a very important one in Guo Xiang, because it's not existent actually, not discussed at least so much in Zhuangzi itself, but created by Guo Xiang. And this idea about you say footprint, but also that reminds me of another Western notion like I like is deconstruction, you know, not of it's trace. Is a very important notion in Derrida's deconstruction. And according to Derrida, what is trace? Trace, but I think he gave a very interesting interpretation, I mean Derrida. And he said trace is a kind of mark, but it's a mark of something, you know, it's absent present, yet functions as a kind of the condition of thought or experience, which means that something maybe is not present, but it's absent, but it's always like trace. It's not something obvious. It's not like like this definite mark, but it's always have a kind of mark which also require the person to be you know, to remind people of what's there that you have to follow. So if we are, I think this might help also to understand Guo Xiang's critique of trace here, because trace, if you make it as kind of something particular, something fixed or something as authoritative, then it becomes a kind of obstacles to act in a spontaneous way or to act in a Ziran way, right? I don't know if you agree with that or not. Let me see what else I want to say. Yeah, I want to say more about what's the. Just I have just a very easy, straightforward question. What I mean, according to your interpretation, what's the connection between Ziran Wei and Xiaoyao?
Okay. Yeah, so Mingjiao is definitely a type of Mingjiao. For people who don't know, it's Ming is like name. So you sometimes use reputation. I have a paper where I argue that you can understand it almost as identity, actually, in a certain context. But Ming also, so in this Mingjiao, Jiao means to teach, right? And then Mingjiao is the teaching of names, but it means specifically like ren yi, li, yeah, like things like this. So it's speaking to, you walk down to your school and you have all those sin you guys also use, and I forget the other ones. So it's speaking, right, because you had very thick notions of ethical shared values in this time period. So Mingjiao is like the teaching of these, right? And your Xiao, of course, is really important, right? So some people became famous because they mourned for 10 years, right? And then other people became famous because they mourned for 15 years, right? And this is considered some sort of type of Mingjiao, right? Because you go according to, it's like a standard, basically. And then Xuanxue thinkers are usually understood as Ziran instead of Mingjiao. So they're understood as opposing. And so as far as I understand the question, right? Like if we understand Mingjiao and Ziran as opposing, then isn't Ziran opposed to convention? Yeah, in some sense. But I would say, first of all, it sort of allows you this, I don't want to say critical distance again, but it gives you this sort of posture towards Mingjiao that lets you be more reflective when thinking about it. So it's not about just following Mingjiao, but it's also not about not following Mingjiao, right? That's a critical difference, is that Ziran doesn't necessitate that you don't follow Mingjiao. In the Zhuangzi, you have stories, people like to talk about the stories of, for example, Meng Xuncai, right? Sorry, not him, but the story before as well. People who don't mourn when their friend dies, right? They're playing some, right? They're playing some other music. They don't follow the rites or the rituals. But you also have people who do follow the rites and the rituals, right? Meng Xuncai is one of the great examples, but there's others in the text, right? There's a story about a tree that's taken as a shu, and that plays very well the role of sort of the center of society, right? Because villages were often constructed around trees or around like an important rock, mostly trees though, right? I don't think that Ziran is necessarily opposed. That's what I was saying. So it's not that it's not that it tells you to follow convention or customs, but it doesn't also tell you not to follow them. And the way that it's often phrased in English language literature is as if Ziran tells you not to follow convention, which I don't think it does.
To make myself clear.
Okay, sorry.
I think one of the reasons people, not just Western scholars, but the Chinese scholars also tend to make it as against convention. I think because what happened in the Weijing period, like Luanji deliberately, mock at any kind of conventions, and the ultimate way for Weijing scholars not to follow conventions is that they don't even wear clothes. They were naked.
Or he got drunk for 100 days
Yeah.
straight so that he didn't have to, but he used the convention to oppose the convention, right? He got drunk for 100 days straight so that he wouldn't have to get married to someone he didn't want to, because you can't accept a proposal when you're drunk, right? So I also think it's about, there's also that element. But yeah, Ranji, Jikong, the so-called seven worthies of the Bamboo Grove, they're the sort of the bad boys, right? They're the anti-convention. They like to hang out in the Bamboo Grove, I guess, right? Play music, do some art, drink a lot of alcohol. Yeah, they're the Taoist hippies, right? I mean, Wang Bi died when he was like 21, probably because he was smoking this weird like metal, basically, right? It started a new fashion because the Han clothing was very tight, and then you would smoke this metal. It was apparently made you very hot and very like high, like cocaine or something. And then people would dig holes and go in the ground because it's to cool off. They didn't have air conditioning. And then they had loose clothing and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, so there is certainly, and there's always this tendency in Taoism, there's this, but I would say rather than going against convention, it's a space to reflect critically on convention. So because it never tells you to be anti-convention, it just lets you, it lets you do things like get drunk for 100 days straight so you don't have to accept a proposal, right? So yeah, so that's the first question. The second one is, I think, I don't know Derrida basically at all. But the way you describe trace, and this is actually, this is a criticism that Richard John Lynn uses the term footprints to translate G, and he criticizes Burke-Zipporn for trace because he says it's too Derridaian. And he says that Zipporn must have been, I forget, actually, I don't want to, because being, I forget exactly what he said, but anyways, but the trace or the G is actually the opposite of, from what I can tell from what you said about Derrida, because the G is actually something very clear, right? Demetra like does this when she like stands here and here, and she walks around like this, and she like does this with her hand. Da, da, da. So I follow all those things. They're actually very like, they're very well known. So, or they're very obvious. That's why I use this cookie cutter, right? So the contours are very clear. So it's, from what I understand, it's very different from Derrida's trace, which is like something amorphic, right? Something that's very difficult to sort of grasp. Guo Xiang's Ji is quite the opposite. What's difficult is the Suoyi Ji. The Suoyi Ji is Ziran, that which left the trace, basically, or that by which the trace was made. And then the third, the connection to Xiaoyao. I don't know. I'm not really sure. Oh yeah. Sorry. I don't know. I really don't know what Xiaoyao means. Because in the Han Dynasty, for example, it meant something more like being like lost and blinded, actually. And then some people take it as more like being free and easy. And in the Xiaoyao chapter, it's not always so free and easy. You have this discussion, for example, it ends with use and uselessness, which is complicated and not, I think, usually treated in a more superficial fashion, but it's not, I think it's not just about floating down the river and having a good time. The same thing that the big bird, right, which is how Xiaoyao starts, right? That's the fish that transforms into the big bird, and then the other birds laugh at them. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to interpret that, and I definitely think there's a relationship there, but I wouldn't want to say anything too concretely because I'd feel like I'd have to really study it. Yo is my preferred translation of genuine pretending into Chinese. That's what I would say. And I think everyone is always genuine pretending. And I think it's basically being Ziran and Wuwei. And when you're not being Ziran and Wuwei, when you're trying to follow some sort of model, then you're pretending to be genuine. So I would say Yo is related, but Xiaoyao Yo, that's difficult.
You actually say the whole idea about Xiaoyao.
Yeah,
It is
yeah.
considered as like a non-attached, totally free. But in Xiaoyao, you see that Zhuangzi uses kind of a method of gradual negation. Talk about big bird, then he's not Xiaoyao. Talk about small bird, small thing, they are not Xiaoyao, and even Li is not Xiaoyao. Everybody is not Xiaoyao. So you always want ask question, who is Xiaoyao here? And look like he doesn't say who is Xiaoyao here, but the only sentence he talk about is that somebody who can, who is 这六气之变, who promotes the change of the 六气. And then he give a conclusion that the sage has no name, a person, 智人无己, 圣人无名, 神人无功. That's it. But you have no clue who is Xiaoyao here.
I think it's I actually think it's not, I think you should read it not as this is my own interpretation, right? That the 无名, 无疾无功, it should be more like 无待名, 无待疾, 无待功. So you shouldn't rely on these things. And so in that way, I think, I don't know, to go out on a limb and just answer maybe actually everyone is Xiao Yao, but if you don't realize it, then you're not being Xiao Yao. Exactly. That's what I'm going for here. Yeah. Everyone is Xiao Yao. It's just a matter of sort of realizing it or not. Yeah, but I totally agree with you that this is a very difficult concept to sort of nail down. So yeah. No, thank you.
Okay, next we have Luke.
All right, so sorry. That was amazing exchange there. Just have to say, I don't think I'll be wandering my way into the scriptural battleground here. So this is just a basic question from a student interested in doing work. So on the topic of this idea of sort of establishing a critical distance with the material, and I guess trying to build bridge from both directions, as it were, rather than just reviewing only the English language stuff. This matter of like, oh, we always have to find an ethical angle, right? Because you're looking to publish, right? And the idea is that publisher is going to look for, oh, how can I market this? Well, we can situate it in the discourse of an ongoing ethical, whatever. So how do you, I mean, I know you and Georg have just sort of done this bit on, amorality as opposed to immorality or non-morality, et cetera. How do you like get this stuff out there? Because you just said that you're able to get this published, yeah?
Yeah, so there's a couple. I mean, Georg is much better on this than I. So first of all, I don't really publish stuff that's sort of. We were walking on the Colon Hill last week, like a week ago. I was telling him about the presentation, and we decided, I'm more about sort of saying, if you build up all this ethical stuff, like Daoism sort of dissolves it, and he's more saying that Daoism sort of argues against it, which I think both are good interpretations, right? I'm just not as good. I'm not as German as him. I can't make these strong arguments. So, so there's a little bit of difference there. But in terms of getting it published, it's not that difficult because you can always do something like say that doing this type of reflection helps us like look at things differently and blah blah blah, and sort of leave the question open so that people will interpret it as having some sort of moral angle, but then you didn't necessarily say it. So Georg would probably glad he's not here, he'd probably disagree with me on this, right? But that's sort of my method, right, is to leave it sort of open, right? So if I have to write a paper about Daoism and environmentalism, which I had to do on at least 2 occasions, right? Which I say that they're not compatible. But then at the end, I just say something like, but maybe you can use this type of thinking to reevaluate ethical issues. But I don't do it myself, right? Which is true. I mean, I'm being honest the whole time, right? So that's one way. The other way is to just do something sort of more hardcore textual, right? And then you don't have to have the ethical spin. Okay. Yeah. So because a lot of scholarship is basically people just trying to show off some idea that they have, right? And then when you're doing that, then you have to have something ethical. But I think if you're being more humble as a scholar and just trying, like I'm just trying to do here, right? Like, what did I really say? Basically nothing. You know what I mean? Like, I just showed you some quotes from some English language scholars, some quotes from Guo Xiang. I made you guys read them for me, and then it's over, right? And then you can sort of get away with being less ethical too. So
okay, 2 parts there. You're already established, not the same position, not the same footprints or traces to follow.
Yeah, of course.
Other part, Georg is in the chat. He'll come after you in a minute. Third part, so about the really hardcore like scholarship work, like where do we start? Like if I'm an English language, kind of creature, my Mandarin is pretty terrible. How am I going to get into this Chinese literature? Right, just to really do, as I understand it, good comparative philosophy.
Yeah, learn to read Chinese, number 1. Yeah, no, I mean anything translated it loses a lot.
And that's what I'm noticing is like even using words here that you've tried to you have to talk your way around them and digestive and you say like, well, if I use these, then Ben over here is going to chew me out because it's used elsewhere already. Right. So we are kind of Viridian.
Which he's not. He's a nice guy. Yeah. But we can use him, because he's so nice. We could just make fun of him like this, right?
Right, but that's the word. So I try to make a distinction between something like artificial history or false history or something. Well, then an analytic philosopher will say, what the hell do you mean by this? I'm like, well, I'm trying to articulate 2 very similar but different ideas here.
So what I mean, one of the ways I start off with this, and this is the thing I still do, is I'm basically most of the time just summarizing English language scholarship and Chinese language scholarship. So you learn to read Chinese and then you summarize the scholarship. And I'm writing stuff I'm not trying to impress anyone on this side of the table. I'm only trying to help people on that side. So no offense, but I frankly don't care what professors think because they don't normally change their minds very much, right? So what I try to do is really make a contribution into helping students. Like every paper I write, basically every paper I write comes from a class where a student had a question, and I thought it would be great if there was a paper that answered this question. So then I go and write it. So write it for other people, not for yourself. I think that's like number one, and use there's already so much good stuff, right? Like if philosophy was so easy, which again, I mean, of course, Wang Bi might, or like Hume, right? They're great exceptions to this, but probably we're not. I know I'm not. Coming up with something so original and so great at the age of 38, right? Just summarize other people's stuff. They already wrote good stuff, right? So basically, I feel like a secretary.
You're an inspiration as a secretary. I'll let you know. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I see a hand raised next by Professor Muller.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me and see me? Because I still see Paul's slides. I don't know.
I see you, Georg.
Okay. I want to talk, since my name came up a few times regarding the discussions about ethics and amorality. I just want to say a few things, basically just one thing. I think I liked how Paul highlighted the criticism by Guo Xiang and generally by these Daoists, starting with the Zhuangzi, is an attack against morality because of pretense and hypocrisy. There are many quotes that Paul mentioned that point this out very clearly. So that's I think very important to recognize. And for me, that expresses a critique of morality that I summarize in the formula, a therapeutic but not normative. So I think the Taoist approach is, and the Taoist critique of morality points out that to use Paul's language, that it fosters, cultivates an attitude that is normative, and that precisely this kind of normative attitude that is kind of, again, like cultivated if you operate in the mode of morality, is somehow unhealthy and leads to pretense and hypocrisy. And so I see the whole approach of Taoism, of this kind of Taoism that Paul was talking about, as therapeutic, and that is in line with general interpretations of Taoism as very strongly medicinal in nature. And I also think that the critique of morality and the critique of ethics is part of this medicinal or therapeutic approach. So when I conceive of Taoism as amoral, then this is based in this understanding of Taoism, that it regards the moralistic attitude as potentially very pathological. And that also means it, as just Paul outlined in his reading of Guo Xiang and in his critique of the Western scholars, that it isn't very helpful to kind of retranslate this therapeutic approach into today's normative moralistic discourses. It's kind of, in my reading, that's when Paul was referencing the discussion we just had a few days before. That I think is the major problem of these contemporary Western readings, which for academic discourse reasons reread the text as formulating some form of alternative ethics. And again, like, I think the problem is that this kind of obscures the therapeutic attitude of the text. That's just what I wanted to clarify. Hope it's clear enough.
Here, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay. So I wonder maybe if part of the problem, right? Because you like you don't always have so much success with this argument, right? And I maybe right, like what I'm speaking about too is generally that also the fact that you sort of have to make these moral and ethical claims, right, in research, and especially like when you give a paper and stuff
Right.
like this, not just you but people
Right.
in general, right? And I wonder
Right.
if part of the reason is because morality and ethics today, like part of the reason that this type of critique doesn't work, right, or this type of criticism doesn't work, that morality or ethics can lead to pretense or hypocrisy, is that because today it doesn't, for the
Do you
most
think
part, right?
today
No, because what I'm talking
morality-
about is, so if you're living in a very different society, right, like the one that Guo Xiang is living in, then people like, it's like how they dress, how they talk, how they do all these things. Everyone knows these things about other people, right? And they're like, the values are very much, they're very thick and they're shared, right? So when someone is acting and talking and walking and dressing in certain ways, right, you can they do so, and then maybe you find out that they're a hypocrite, right, or that they're pretending or something like this. But today you know so little about someone, and what is sort of like moral or ethical is so thin that it doesn't often reach the level where you would then say that they're
No, I mean,
pretending.
it's completely different expressions, but whatever, like, since you asked me, I would regard somehow wokeism as a contemporary, very common form of moralism. And I mean, that's my argument against wokeism. It's completely a Guo Xiang argument. It's not about clothing and following conventions. It's about a kind of a moralistic attitude in today's context, which produces unease. So I think that we are living as much in moralistic times today as at any time. I don't think our times are less moralistic than the times of the Wei Jin period or of the Xianqin period. It's just that the moralism takes on a different form, but the result of the moralism is the same, namely that it produces unease, and unease is the opposite of xiao yao you. The problem that Daoism finds in morality, be it a Confucian sincere morality or a wokeist prophilic morality, is that whatever morality it is, it produces unease. It prevents xiao yao you, right? Once you're in the wokeism attitude, you basically destroy the basis of achieving yo. And that's a general problem with morality, no matter if it's a morality in a traditional Chinese sincere context or in a contemporary postmodernist prophilic context.
Sounds good.
Okay, so what I have here is a comment from Violet in the chat. However, I'm going to defer from reading it directly because it contains a number of Chinese characters that I do not know how to utter. So if I could rely on our speaker to perhaps read the comment.
Yeah, sure. Or Violet, if you're there and you want to read it, you can.
That's of course an option. I tend to assume that those who post would prefer not to also speak, although of course that need not be necessary.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, which term is obscured or fake?
Oh no, can you maybe just read your comment?
Oh, I just have some comments. That is, I think the idea of tong, it reminds me the idea in Chinese Chan. There is a idea in Chan that is 不离两边,不落两边. That means that as the individual, we don't trap that we don't trap it on the margin, and then at the same time we are relative to the margin, so we are not detached. I don't know, we are not absolutely detached from the margin, but we still keep our relationship with the margin. I think the margin is indicates something, what it means, the for example, the society or the relationship in the mundane, something like that. I think through this way, the individual can practice tone that is free floating, I think, in everywhere, in society or in the mountain. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I don't know much about Chan, and I don't know much about how pian or margin is being used here, but yeah, thanks for the comment, I guess. Or maybe, yeah, Ellen,
I
you,
think she agree with you when you talk about relation between conventional
okay, yeah, yeah.
conventions and Ziran, and she tried to say like in Zen Buddhism talk about avoid two extremes. You
Okay,
know,
yeah, yeah,
it's a
yeah.
non-attachment, but doesn't mean that you get rid of two extremes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
exactly what you said about.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So basically, she agree with you.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. And I think that, yeah, that can be a way to see like Xiao Yao or Yo, right? Is like you can also Yo in convention, right? Guo Xiang basically talks about this, or in the Zhuangzi and some of the outer chapters, you talk about like a jituo, like a temporary resting place that you can use. And that can be conventions or customs.
And it also can relate to the argument we also ask whether Zhuangzi is 入世出世, and they say it's neither 出世 or 入世, actually it's 有世, right?
Okay, so we are formally speaking at the end of our time together. I did want to acknowledge quickly that I note one further request to comment from Angela in the chat. We don't have time, I think, to actually proceed with that, although perhaps with your permission, I could share a contact email in the chat with them. Okay, so then you can carry on that correspondence on your own terms. With that, I would ask us to all thank Professor D'Ambrosio once again.
Thank you guys, because when you give a talk, the audience really matters. So having you guys engaged was really great. Thanks.